Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The opening should immediately grab the viewer by challenging what they think they know. A dramatic voiceover, set against visuals of colonial ships, dense Virginia forests, and a solemn young woman in traditional Powhatan attire poses a powerful question. You've heard the Disney version, but what if I told you the real Pocahontas story is darker, more tragic, and far more powerful? This line hooks the audience by contrasting the widely accepted sanitized tale with the emotional weight of historical truth. The familiar narrative of a cheerful cultural bridge builder who saves John Smith and lives happily ever after is embedded in pop culture, but the video promises to peel back those layers and reveal something deeper. A tale of cultural clash, political manipulation, captivity, and identity loss. By teasing myths and hidden truths, the introduction invites viewers into a journey of re-examination, not just of Pocahontas, but of how history itself is told and retold to fit agendas. The goal is to create both intrigue and urgency, compelling the audience to keep watching for a story they didn't know they needed to hear. Pocahontas is one of the most iconic figures in American popular culture, often depicted as a beautiful, free-spirited Native American princess who bridged two worlds with love and understanding. Thanks to movies, children's books, and tourist merchandise, she's frequently shown as the noble heroine who saved English explorer John Smith from execution and helped bring peace between Native peoples and European settlers. But this romanticized image, complete with catchy songs and happy endings, has little to do with the real woman behind the name. In reality, Pocahontas was a young Powhatan girl whose life was shaped by violence, colonial conquest, and personal tragedy. This video's mission is to separate the myth from the truth, to uncover the historical Pocahontas, not the legend crafted for entertainment, but the human being caught in the tides of empire. By doing so, we gain not only a clearer picture of the past, but a deeper understanding of the cost of erasing indigenous voices from their own stories. Before English ships ever touched the shores of what would become Virginia, the land was known as Senecomica, densely inhabited land, home to a powerful indigenous alliance called the Powhatan Confederacy. This network of more than 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes was ruled by Chief Wahunsenacau, who was known to the English as Powhatan. He commanded thousands of warriors, controlled vital trade routes, and presided over a complex society with its own diplomacy, religion, and social systems. These communities thrived by fishing, farming corn and squash, hunting game, and maintaining a deep spiritual connection with the land. Mataoaka, better known by the nickname Pocahontas, emerged into a world rich with cultural traditions, political complexities, and deep-rooted social systems that sharply contrasted with the colonial narratives later imposed upon her. Born around 1596, she was the daughter of Wahunsenacau, known to the English as Chief Powhatan, the powerful leader of a political and tribal confederacy that governed over 30 Algonquian-speaking groups across what is now Virginia. As his daughter, Pocahontas was not merely a figure of familial affection but also one of social importance. Although not a princess in the Western monarchical sense, her position within the Powhatan hierarchy likely carried ceremonial weight and responsibilities tied to diplomacy, alliance building, and the performance of sacred or communal rituals. The name Pocahontas, meaning playful one or mischievous girl, reflects how she was perceived within her community: lively, spirited, and perhaps unusually independent for her age. However, her true name, Mataoaka, was kept more private in accordance with indigenous spiritual customs. In Powhatan culture, names had power, and revealing a true name could leave one vulnerable to harm or spiritual manipulation. Thus, the widespread use of her nickname even in historical texts reflects a colonial lens, one that often overlooked or misunderstood the spiritual significance of naming in indigenous societies. Pocahontas' upbringing was deeply immersed in the rhythms of her people's world, marked by seasonal cycles, oral tradition, subsistence farming, fishing, and complex clan-based governance. She would have been educated in the practical skills needed for survival and cultural continuity, including gathering food, preparing materials, understanding herbal medicine, and learning stories and songs that carried moral and spiritual knowledge. Her early life would have been rooted in the Powhatan belief system, which emphasized harmony with the natural world, respect for communal elders, and the importance of balance and reciprocity in both nature and society. The common Western depiction of Pocahontas as a bridge between two worlds, or as a romantic figure who fell in love with John Smith, strips away the context of her real identity and the power dynamics at play. The arrival of the English in 1607 at Jamestown disrupted the Powhatan world. What began as a wary interaction soon devolved into conflict, as the settlers encroached on indigenous land and resources. Pocahontas's role during this time was likely diplomatic, used by her father and community as a symbol of goodwill or leverage in negotiations with the English. While popular mythology dramatizes her saving John Smith, the historical evidence is ambiguous, and some scholars argue that what Smith interpreted as a rescue may have been a ritual adoption or a symbolic gesture within Powhatan customs. Thus, Pocahontas's early years were shaped not by fairy tales, but by the realpolitik of indigenous diplomacy, the expectations placed upon her as a high-status child, and the looming pressure of colonial expansion. Her identity was rooted in a society that valued interconnectedness, spiritual depth, and communal leadership, values that were often distorted or ignored by European observers. Understanding Pocahontas as Matawaka, within the full context of her culture, heritage, and historical circumstances, is crucial to honoring the complexity of her life and the nation she came from, rather than reducing her to a legend shaped by colonial myth-making. In 1607, 3 English ships arrived at the mouth of the James River, establishing the Jamestown settlement, England's first permanent colony in North America. To the Powhatan people, this was not a welcome development, but the beginning of a tense and precarious relationship. The newcomers were ill-equipped for survival, relied heavily on native generosity for food, and soon began making increasing demands on local resources. Initial diplomacy quickly gave way to suspicion and periodic violence, as both sides vied for power and security in a land they saw from very different worldviews. Into this tension stepped John Smith, one of the more well-known English figures due to his own embellishments of his adventures. According to Smith's later writings, he was captured by Powhatan warriors and brought before Chief Powhatan to be executed, only to be saved at the last moment by the dramatic intervention of Pocahontas, who supposedly threw herself across him to spare his life. This story, retold countless times and romanticized in films, is now widely debated by historians. Some argue Smith exaggerated or misunderstood what was actually a traditional adoption or ritual performance meant to symbolize his incorporation into the tribe. Others believe the event may not have happened at all, especially since Smith didn't mention it until years after it supposedly occurred. The enduring myth of Pocahontas as a love-struck heroine who bridged two worlds through romance is one of the most persistent distortions in American historical memory. In reality, when she first encountered John Smith around 1607, Pocahontas was a child, likely no older than 10 or 11 years old. The romantic narrative, which emerged largely from Smith's later writings and was further embellished by 19th and 20th century cultural portrayals, projects Western ideals of femininity, innocence, and savior tropes onto a relationship that, historically, could not have had romantic dimensions. This reinterpretation serves more to comfort colonial guilt and create a feel-good origin story than to reflect the truth of cross-cultural contact in the early 17th century. Understanding Pocahontas's real role requires reframing her actions through the lens of Powhatan cultural norms and political strategies. As the daughter of Wahun Senekau, the paramount chief of a powerful confederacy, Pocahontas would have been raised with an acute awareness of her responsibilities within the Eo tribal network. Children of high status in indigenous societies often served ceremonial or symbolic functions in diplomatic engagements. Her presence during certain interactions with the English, such as the often debated episode in which she supposedly saved John Smith, should be understood not as spontaneous acts of personal feeling, but potentially as orchestrated events, designed to convey political messages or perform cultural rituals. Scholars argue that Smith may have misunderstood, or reinterpreted years later, a formal Powhatan ceremony of adoption or incorporation into the tribe, reading it through his own cultural expectations of danger and rescue. Moreover, the relationship between the Powhatan people and the English settlers was fraught from the beginning. What the colonists viewed as their divine right to occupy and extract from the land was seen by the Powhatans as intrusion and aggression. Early contact involved limited trade and uneasy truce, but mutual suspicion ran deep. Language barriers, differing views of land ownership, and contrasting spiritual beliefs created an atmosphere of misunderstanding. As the settlers became more desperate for food and resources, tensions escalated into open conflict. Pocahontas, in this volatile context, was likely seen by both sides as a symbolic figure, by the Powhatans as a diplomatic emissary or cultural mediator, and later by the English as a convenient narrative device. The reality, then, is far more complex and somber than the romanticized fiction. Pocahontas was a child navigating a rapidly changing and dangerous political landscape. Her experiences were not defined by personal romance, but by her community's need to adapt, negotiate, and sometimes resist the growing threat of colonial encroachment. Her story, stripped of myth, reveals the harsh realities of early colonization, cultural dislocation, strategic resistance, and the profound misunderstandings that often arise between very different civilizations. Recognizing her in this light honors her humanity and the cultural world from which she came, rather than reducing her to a pawn in a colonial fairy tale. One of the most enduring myths in American popular culture is the supposed romantic relationship between Pocahontas and John Smith. This narrative, largely popularized by novels, paintings, and later the Disney film, casts Pocahontas as a young native woman who falls in love with the brave English explorer and bridges the gap between two civilizations. But historical records tell a very different story. In truth, Pocahontas was around 10 to 12 years old when she met John Smith, who was in his late 20s. There is absolutely no contemporary evidence of a romantic connection between them. The love story was a later invention, likely used to soften the colonial narrative and to appeal to a Western audience eager for tales of harmony and heroism. The second major myth is that Pocahontas willingly aided the English out of affection or loyalty. The reality is far more complex. Pocahontas, as the daughter of Chief Powhatan, was a symbol of diplomacy and power, often used as a political figure in tense negotiations between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English settlers. Her appearances at Jamestown, described in English accounts, were likely strategic, meant to maintain some control or peace in the face of growing colonial pressure. Over time, as relations deteriorated and resources dwindled, the English became increasingly aggressive. Eventually, Pocahontas was kidnapped by the English in 1613 and held for over a year. During her captivity, she was pressured to convert to Christianity, take a new name, Rebecca, and ultimately married John Rolfe, an English tobacco planter. Pocahontas's marriage to John Rolfe in 1614 has long been mythologized as a symbol of harmony between Native Americans and English colonists, a hopeful moment of cross-cultural unity. However, beneath the surface of this narrative lies a much more complex and uncomfortable truth. The marriage, while legal and real, was not the romantic union often depicted in popular culture. It was, in many ways, a political maneuver, one that served strategic interests for the English and reflected the profound power imbalance that had emerged between the colonizers and the indigenous peoples of Seneca, the Powhatan Confederacy. Baptiste. The time of her marriage, Pocahontas, now baptized as Rebecca, had been forcibly removed from her community. She was kidnapped by the English in 1613 during escalating tensions with her father's confederacy and held for ransom. During her captivity, she was pressured to convert to Christianity and was integrated into English colonial life, which included a new religion, language, and customs, all foreign to her upbringing. Her conversion and subsequent marriage to John Rolfe, a prominent tobacco planter, were seen by English authorities as a tool to pacify native resistance and secure their colonial foothold. Rolfe himself wrote about the political significance of the marriage, portraying it as a divine opportunity for the civilizing of native peoples. This union did bring a temporary peace, known as the Peace of Pocahontas. But that calm masked the deeper reality. It was the product of coercion, not consent. Pocahontas's cultural identity was systematically suppressed, and she became a living symbol of colonial success, a converted savage used to justify expansionist policies. In 1616, she was taken to England as a kind of propaganda figure, paraded before English society to demonstrate the supposed benevolence and triumph of the English mission in the New World. Her presence reassured investors in the Virginia Company that the colonization of America was not only profitable but morally justified. To romanticize this chapter of her life is to ignore the underlying trauma, dislocation, and erasure she endured. Pocahontas's story reflects not a tale of peaceful assimilation, but the human cost of colonization. How indigenous people, particularly women, were used as diplomatic tools and cultural trophies. She died in 1617 at around 21 years old, just as she was preparing to return to her homeland. Her death in England, far from her people and the lands of her birth, symbolically marks the severing of her identity from the one imposed upon her by colonial forces. Understanding the fuller truth of her life doesn't lessen Pocahontas's historical importance, it enhances it. When we strip away the myth and examine the real events, we see a young woman who endured extraordinary upheaval with resilience and grace. She becomes not a background figure in a colonial narrative, but a central figure in a larger story about survival, cultural clash, and the ways in which history is often rewritten to comfort the powerful. Reclaiming her story means acknowledging the cost of empire and honoring the complexity of her lived experience. In 1613, amid escalating conflict between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English settlers, Pocahontas was kidnapped by English Captain Samuel Argall in a calculated move to gain leverage. At the time, hostilities had intensified. Settlers were desperate for food and security, and the Powhatans were resisting colonial encroachment. Pocahontas, already a symbolic figure due to her father's high status, became a valuable pawn in this geopolitical struggle. She was taken to Jamestown and then Henricus, where she was held for over a year. The English demanded the return of stolen weapons and prisoners in exchange for her release, but negotiations stalled. During her captivity, Pocahontas was placed under the supervision of English settlers who sought to indoctrinate her into English customs and religion. She was taught Christianity, baptized as Rebecca, and encouraged to adopt the English way of life. Some historians argue that she may have partially assimilated as a survival tactic, an attempt to retain some agency in an environment where she had little power. Others suggest that, after a prolonged separation from her people and the trauma of abduction, she began to internalize the new identity imposed on her. In 1614, she married John Rolfe, a tobacco planter known for introducing a successful strain of tobacco that would transform Virginia's economy. The marriage was presented as a peace union that ushered in a brief period of stability between the Powhatans and the English. But despite later romantic portrayals, this was not a love story. It was a highly political act. Rolfe himself acknowledged in letters that he struggled with the idea of marrying a heathen, and that his decision was rooted in both religious and colonial motivations. For the English, the union offered a propaganda victory. A native woman converted and wed to a Christian Englishman. For the Powhatans, it may have represented an uneasy compromise, or even an attempt to secure the safety of their people. Pocahontas's capture and subsequent conversion weren't just pivotal moments in her personal life. They reflected the broader pattern of cultural domination that defined colonialism. Her transformation from Mataoaka, the Powhatan girl, to Rebecca, the English wife, symbolizes the loss and adaptation indigenous people were forced to endure. In 1616, Pocahontas, now known as Rebecca Rolfe, was taken to England, primarily as part of a propaganda campaign to generate support for the struggling Jamestown colony. The English saw her as a living symbol of their success in civilizing the native people. Pocahontas's arrival in England was meticulously orchestrated. She was presented to the public as a civilized savage who had embraced English ways, including Christianity, and as proof that Native Americans could be assimilated into English culture. Her marriage to John Rolfe was framed as a triumph of English colonial policy. In London, Pocahontas was paraded through the streets, invited to royal court, and even met with King James I and Queen Anne. She was hailed as an exotic curiosity, an example of the English Empire's power to reshape and control the New World. Pocahontas, however, was more than just a pawn in this grand colonial scheme. While she was presented as a successful convert, it's likely that she was both disoriented and alienated in this foreign society. For a young woman who had been taken from her homeland and people, the pressures of her public role must have been immense. Unfortunately, Pocahontas's time in England was short and tragic. In March 1617, just before she was set to return to Virginia, she fell ill and died at the age of around 20 or 21. The cause of her death remains uncertain. Historians speculate that it was due to disease, possibly tuberculosis or pneumonia, which was common in the early 17th century. Some also believe that the stress of her forced relocation and her exposure to English diseases weakened her health. Pocahontas's death marked a sorrowful end to a brief life shaped by tragedy, loss, and manipulation. She was buried in Gravesend, England, but her legacy was far from over. The story of Pocahontas continued to be mythologized in both England and America, with her life and image becoming a symbol of colonial triumph and the complex, often painful relationships between Native Americans and European settlers. Pocahontas's legacy has been shaped by centuries of distortion and romanticization. Her image was used to justify colonization, and her story became emblematic of the English colonial narrative. The notion of the civilized savage was a powerful tool in justifying the English treatment of Native populations. Pocahontas's conversion to Christianity and her assimilation into English society were framed as proof that Native Americans could be civilized and integrated into European culture, reinforcing the idea that colonialism was not only inevitable, but beneficial for Native peoples. As the years passed, her story was transformed to fit the narrative that Europeans wanted to promote. Early American colonists, eager to distance themselves from England, embraced the romanticized story of Pocahontas as an embodiment of peaceful relations between the English and the native tribes. The tale of her saving John Smith, for example, became one of the most enduring myths, despite a lack of historical evidence to support it. This myth, along with other aspects of her life, was simplified and distorted in countless plays, books, and later films, particularly in the 20th century. Disney's 1995 animated film, for instance, portrayed Pocahontas as a free-spirited heroine who embraced nature and love, but it omitted the complexity of her forced marriage to John Rolfe, her captivity, and the systemic violence that affected her people. In modern times, Pocahontas's legacy is a topic of complex debate among Native American communities and historians. For many Native people, particularly those from the Powhatan Confederacy and related tribes, the romanticization of Pocahontas has often felt like an erasure of their true history and the ongoing consequences of colonialism. The narrative of Pocahontas as a symbol of peace between Native Americans and Europeans, while compelling, overlooks the larger context of violence, land theft, and forced assimilation that Native communities endured. Many see the distortion of her story as a tool of colonial propaganda that has minimized the true suffering of Indigenous peoples. At the same time, there are Native American perspectives that acknowledge Pocahontas as a real historical figure who navigated a complex and often brutal world. Some view her story as a symbol of survival and adaptation, a young woman who, in her own way, tried to make the best of a terrible situation. Yet, it's important to understand that her life, like that of many Indigenous people during colonization, was marked by a series of painful compromises and losses. Pocahontas's legacy transcends her portrayal as a simplistic bridge between two cultures. While this image has been romanticized, it obscures the deeper and more painful realities of her life and the historical context in which she lived. Her story, and the myths constructed around it, reflect the broader struggle to reconcile Indigenous history with the colonial narratives that have long dominated American history. Through this lens, Pocahontas becomes not only a symbol of the complex dynamics between Native peoples and European settlers, but also a poignant reminder of the need to confront the colonial damage done to Indigenous communities, cultures, and identities. The colonial myths surrounding Pocahontas's life, such as the notions of her romantic relationship with John Smith or her peaceful assimilation into European society, have long been used to justify the actions and ideologies of colonization. These myths serve to erase the violence, coercion, and cultural erasure faced by Indigenous peoples, particularly women, during the colonization of North America. By focusing on the idea of Pocahontas as a civilized Native woman who willingly embraced European norms, these myths reinforce the illusion that Indigenous cultures were inferior or in need of saving. They obscure the painful reality that Pocahontas, like countless other indigenous people, was forced to navigate a world in which her identity was being systematically dismantled by the forces of colonialism. Pocahontas's story, when viewed in its full complexity, highlights the importance of centering indigenous voices in the telling of American history. For too long, the history of indigenous peoples has been relegated to the margins, and their stories have been told through the lens of those who colonized them. In order to restore a more accurate and just historical narrative, we must listen to the perspectives of indigenous people themselves, acknowledging their experiences, resilience, and agency in the face of colonization. Pocahontas, as a historical figure, represents just one example of how indigenous peoples have been misrepresented, mythologized, and misunderstood in mainstream history. Her legacy calls for a more honest reckoning with the past, one that places indigenous voices at the center of the conversation. By recognizing the full scope of Pocahontas's life, not as a symbol of peace but as a young woman caught in the violent currents of colonization, we can begin to dismantle the myths that have shaped American history. Her story reminds us of the ongoing struggle to honor indigenous histories, protect indigenous sovereignty, and recognize the profound impact of colonization on Native communities. In doing so, we not only restore Pocahontas's agency, but also contribute to a broader effort to reclaim and preserve indigenous narratives for future generations. Pocahontas's story is much more than the romanticized tale we've been told for centuries. From her early life as Mataoaka, a member of the Powhatan Confederacy, to her forced captivity and marriage to John Rolfe, the truth behind her story is layered with complexity, struggle, and painful compromise. Her life, far from being a simple narrative of peace between cultures, is a reflection of the brutal reality of colonialism, the manipulation of indigenous peoples, and the distortion of history for political purposes. By uncovering the facts about Pocahontas, we gain a deeper understanding of the personal toll of colonialism, not just on individuals but on entire cultures. Her story is not just one of personal tragedy, but of a broader history of exploitation, loss, and resilience. For us today, understanding the truth behind her story is vital. It allows us to see how myths and historical distortions can shape perceptions, and it challenges us to reckon with the uncomfortable truths of the past. Pocahontas's life forces us to question the narratives we've inherited, reminding us that history is often told through the lens of power, and that the voices of the marginalized, like Pocahontas, are often silenced or twisted. It's important to recognize the legacy of colonization, not just in terms of past injustices, but in the ways these stories continue to shape the present. By revisiting Pocahontas's life and legacy with an open mind, we can begin to understand the real impact of colonialism and strive to honor the true histories of indigenous peoples. Understanding the truth matters because it gives power back to the people whose stories have been erased or distorted, allowing us to acknowledge their suffering and resilience in a more honest and respectful way. Now that we've uncovered the truth behind Pocahontas's story, I'd love to hear from you. What surprised you the most about her real life? Was there something that challenged the version of the story you were taught? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you're interested in exploring more untold history, check out our videos on the real story of Sacagawea and the myth of Thanksgiving, where we dive deep into the truth behind these iconic figures and events. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more true history stories that reveal the facts often left out of the textbooks. Stay curious and let's keep exploring the past together.